Welcome, everyone. The River and the Creation Care Committee. Lord be with you. And also with you. Let us pray. God, our Father and Creator, we give you thanks for the wonder of creation which inspires us, for the fruit of the earth which feeds us, and for the joy of life which gives us hope. Heal the places where your creation has been marred, and restore all creatures to the splendor of your glory, that all may delight once again in your goodness. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. Amen. We welcome Steve Whitty today. He's been a member of Trinity since 1976, and he is, I call him the father of the Great Smoky Mountains. So he said he has a lot to say, so I'm going to let him give his talk to you and tell us about his love.
Okay. Well, thank you and good morning. I tend to talk too much and talk too loud. Can anybody hear me?
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Okay, we're going to talk about the Great Smoky Mountains. And I'm going to try and get a complicated subject into a simplification. If you look around, we all live in the Appalachian Mountains. Starts in Maine, goes into Georgia. And most of the land in western North Carolina are mountains. Now, according to Lang Hornthal, a member of Trinity, who's an eco-forester, Lang says that approximately 4 million acres in our mountains, in our area are mountains. And approximately 70% of the mountains are in private land. So what about the other 30%? Okay. We have national forests in our area. Their mission is to sustain the health and productivity of national forests and grasslands to present future generations through resource management. Now, in our area, we have Pisgah, we have Nantahala, we have Cherokee National Forest, and they're much like a national park in that they have camping facilities, they have campgrounds, they have hiking trails, outdoor programs. And the difference in a national park is you can cut timber with a permit and you can hunt. Then we got state parks in our area. We got Mount Mitchell, we got DuPont State Park over between Brevard and Hendersonville. We've got up at Lake Toxaway, we've got Gorgeous State Park, and we're soon to get, I think they're gonna call it Pisgah View State Park, 15 miles from Asheville, out in the Cogburn Ranch property. Then we got national parks in our area. Now, the national parks are all part of the Interior Department, which was established in 1849. And among the national parks, they have Indian Affairs, Fish and Wildlife, Bureau of Land Management. Now, the first national park was Yellowstone. Most of you have been to Yellowstone. And they're followed by Yosemite, or as we used to say in Waynesville, Yosemite. And then we got Mount Rainier. The National Park Service was formed in 1916, and their mission was to preserve and protect. Now, let me tell you about the National Park Service. They have 455 sites in the National Park Service, and they have 29 designations. Now, they have national memorials. They got the Washington Monument, and they got the Statue of Liberty. Then they got 4 national parkways. Got the Blue Ridge Parkway, we got Natchez Trace, George Washington Parkway, Columbial Parkway, and Williamsburg. They're all part of the Park Service. We got national seashores. That's Atlantique and Chincoteague. Then we got national historic sites like Carl Sandburg over in Flatlock. Getting complicated, isn't it? Yeah. Then we have 16 national parks. We got Everglades, Grand Canyon, Yellowstone, and we got the Great Smoky Mountains. So we're getting there. Ken Burns, the TV producer, said that national parks were America's best idea. And I think that's true. He started here. So we are blessed to live in these beautiful mountains protected by the state and federal government and private groups like the Southern Appalachian Highlands Conservancy that protect our mountains. Some 60 years ago, we had a congressman from Black Mountain named Roy Taylor. Some of you here remember him. And his quote was, "When we look at what we're doing to our mountains, God will forgive us, but our children won't." So let's be thankful to those who are protecting our mountains. Now, let's talk about the Great Smoky Mountains, in particular Cataloochee. You can see this. This is all the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Cataloochee is right down here in this end. Cataloochee Valley. The first people in there, of course, were the Cherokee. And the Cherokee were all over the park, but there was never a major Cherokee town in the park. The reason being, there weren't any big wide valleys with streams. I mean, why would you live in a little enclosed place like Cherokee when you can go to Franklin or Murphy with huge open fields, big slope moving rivers? So Cataloochee is one of the most remote places in Eastern America. And if you don't believe it, we'll go over here sometime. The first deed was written about 1814 to a Caldwell family, but nobody moved in there until the 1840s. So it's not that old. And the people that came in were the Halls, the Hannahs, the Nolans, the Bennetts, the Cooks, and the Woodies and the Palmers. And my grandmother was a Palmer who lived in Cataloochee, and that's by connection. Now, life in the Smokies at that time and now was considered rural, remote, and just isolated pockets of people. And here's some numbers. In 1850, the census showed less than 100 people in there. In 1852, the state of North Carolina decided to build a toll road to Tennessee. It took them 8 years, and it ran from Jonathan's Creek over the mountain, down the mountain, back over the mountain, back over another mountain, and into Cosby, Tennessee. And it was a toll road, much like the road that came right through Asheville, where they could drive herds. That never went to Cataloochee, but it bordered Cataloochee so people could get in there. And so it was completed in 1860, and then people started coming in. Got some more numbers. 1870, census said there were 198 people in that whole valley. Then it went to 391 in 1980. By 1900, there were 1,261 people in Cataloochee here, which is really two valleys. It's Big Cataloochee and Little Cataloochee. But then by 1920 and 30, it had dropped 25% down to 930 people. So what happened in Cataloochee, and this happened in the rest of the park? Well, you got to look at what life was like living in Cataloochee. You know, some people describe it as tranquil, family oriented, large families. Everybody had large families. My father's family had 8, grandmother's family had 9. And the church was the center of the community, and they farmed, they raised cattle, chicken and pigs. They had apple orchards. It was a 3-day trip from Cataloochee into Waynesville. It took you a day to get there. You'd shop, you'd start back, and you get back. My father, who was born in Cataloochee, never went to Waynesville until he was 8 years old. It's the first time he saw an electric light. They sold cattle, they sold crops, they did for themselves, and there was very little cash. So what was happening in Cataloochee and the rest of these communities at that time? Now you're talking about the 20s, and then the 30s came, and here comes the Depression. Well, in Cataloochee, there was no electricity, no paved road, only one small part-time store, no doctor, a one-room school that just went to the 6th grade, no telephone, no cash paying jobs, and they had a post office. The first post office was opened on May 21st, 1873. And at one time, they had 3 post offices. But then on June the 15th, 1932, the last post office closed. And this is the last letter that was written at a Cataloochee post office. And my great aunt Mariah, who I was terrified of, wrote on the outside of this letter, everything in life has an ending. They say, this is the last post office. This day is the last day ever for this post office. Maria Palmer. It was written about a father who lived in Atlanta. It's from his cousin, June the 14th, 1932. And he goes on to talk about how tough life was right then. He said, this is the last day at the Cataloochee Post Office, as it is being discontinued today. You might want to keep this letter as a souvenir, as it will be the last you will ever receive, Mark Cataloochee. From now on, my address will be Cove Creek, North Carolina. Come see us, yours truly, Jarvis. So now they didn't have a post office. So you can imagine what was going on, you know. The young people had left at this time. During the 20s and the 30s, the young people had left. There were no paying jobs. There was no land to expand into because all the flat land that they could cultivate had already been done. They had no future, really, if you were a young person. They had no opportunity for a higher education past the 6th grade. The only paying jobs were out of there. Champion Paper was in, the lumber industry was in, and the world had changed since World War I and had the flu epidemic. I had an uncle that died in there, the flu. So that was what was happening in the park and in Cataloochee. Now, Cage Cove, the same thing was happening. So now let's stop there, clear your mind. Let's talk about the timber industry. Another big thing that happened in there. In 1901, so just think about all these things going on. There was a U.S. Senator named Jeter Pritchard, and he got $10,000 in a congressional appropriation to, quote, investigate the potential for a national park and survey the national inventory to determine the amount of timber in the Appalachian region. This report was called the Lumberman's Dream. Trust me. They had devastated New England, Pennsylvania, up in New York State, and the White Pines of the Great Lakes. So they were looking for new land. They were looking for timber. Nothing really happened until right after World War I. The timber industry moved into the Appalachians and the Great Smokies. And they came with abandon. They bought great tracts of land in the tens of thousands of acres, and they came in and cut with abandon. It was said that the suburbs of the northern cities were built from timber from the Appalachian. Also at this time, Champion Paper came into Canton, and they acquired huge tracts of land in the Smokies, including Lake Logan and all above there. And so they started operating. Now, a little side story about Champion, I read the other day. When they finally sold their land to the national government for the park, after many lawsuits, they took that money. Champion had been started as a pulp mill, and that's the dirty side of paper making. And they'd shipped the pulp back up to Hamilton, Ohio, to the plant there to make the paper. They took the money that they got from their land and made Champion into a paper mill. Most of you have been to Canton and seen that. It's closed now after 115 years. Also read it, I think from back 30 or 40 years, starting in the early 30s. That was the largest paper mill in the world, was Champion Paper.
Wow.
Yeah, they worked, when I was in high school, they worked about 4,000 people, it's huge. So they were in there. So now here come the timber companies. And so they're in the park, and they're everywhere. Now let's talk about how we got the park. So we got the people in there. We got the timber companies in there. How about a park? Well, there were no parks in eastern North Carolina and in eastern America, really, in the 1890s. So in 1893, the North Carolina legislature passed a resolution that said, quote, to establish a national park in the southern Appalachian, a still area covered with primeval forest, practically unimpaired and maintained by the federal government in the interests of science. Well, nothing happened with that. So November the 22nd, 1899, there was a meeting in Asheville. 50 people came and they said, quote, the need for a national park in the state of North Carolina. Then on January the 8th, 1901, a group met at the Asheville Auditorium Company, where W.T. Weaver was the president. And they signed a petition here to get a national park, and they raised $620. It was signed by his names for it, Chase Ambler, W.W. Graham, Charles A. Webb, this George Smathers, you know, a group of old Asheville citizens had this meeting, wrote this letter, and they sent 2 men to Washington to sort of survey and see what they could get, and they talked to a lot of people. One of the rumors is, you know, there's some rumors about the park, that they called on a company that was a, you know, sort of somebody who would promote the park, and they would talk to them, and they said, well, why don't you call it the Great Smokies? And supposedly that's where the term came from, because other time it was just called the Smokies. Now, there were starts and steps to get the park going. In May 1926, finally, Congress passed a law to establish a national park in the east, but prohibited the use of federal money to purchase the land. And that's key. You can have a park, but you got to get the land to pay for it. So they got a federal study commission up, and there was some politics as to who got on the study commission. And they determined where the 2 parks in the east would go. Well, one of them obviously was going to be Shenandoah, because that's close to Washington. So we'll put one in Shenandoah. And then they looked at Grandfather Mountain, and they looked at Linville Gorge, and they looked at the Great Smokies. And they said, we got to be in the Great Smokies. So the next challenge they had was to buy the land for the park. They needed $10 million. Well, Tennessee had already appropriated $500,000, and they bought a big tract over in Tennessee. And they passed the law, they gave another $1.5 million. So there's $2 million. North Carolina finally passed $2 million, the legislature did, so now they had $4 million. But they needed $10 million. All right. There was then a campaign to support the park, to make a national park and to raise some money. And of course, there was an anti-park group, mainly made up of timber companies and Champion Paper. So you had these 2 groups competing. And Dan Pierce, some of you here may know Dan Pierce, he's a dean of the history department at UNCA. He's written a great book about all this. It's about that thick. And I'll tell you, it was a war to get this thing going. He called the raising of the money and the support and opposition to the park, quote, a mighty, undignified campaign. Now, the park supporters, they had books distributed, they had public hearings, they had meetings, they had favorable newspaper articles and editorials, they had tours of the mountains, they had songs of support, they had a huge campaign by little children to raise pennies to give to the park. They had all this going on. The anti-parks group had stressed the loss of jobs, affected timber companies, loss of revenue, just general economic loss, tax loss to the county. So there was just this fight that went on. And this undignified campaign went on for 10 years, from 26 to about 36. I mean, they were just back and forth. Now, also at this time, Armo Camera, and that's who Mount Camera is named for, was charged with a study commission to draw a line as to where the park would be. So what did this undignified campaign with all this going on look like? Well, who got appointed to the study commission? Congressional acts, political interference, lawyers, boundary disputes. Hey, you can't take that. That state senator so forth in Tennessee's farm. You can't take that land. I mean, this kind of appraisal disputes, attorneys, more politics, influential people, meddling politicians, public meetings, jury tampering. So that was in Tennessee. Fist fights at public meetings. The best quote in all this was from attorney for Champion Paper, and his name was Bat Smathers. He said, quote, why these mountains don't qualify as a national park. 75% of them have been cut over, and we've had the chestnut blocked. He said, you know, this land doesn't qualify. So let's talk about the chestnut block. 1904, the chestnut block got to America. It is estimated that 40% of the trees from Maine to Georgia were chestnut trees, and everything lived off the chestnut trees. In 40 years, the blight killed 3.5 billion chestnut trees. And chestnut was used for everything. I've heard that the pews upstairs were chestnut. I don't know if that's true or not. It was a great, but it was all gone. And that was gone out of the mountains. So he said, you know, you don't have the chestnut trees, you cut everything, and, you know, we can't have a park here. So what I've got here to pass around, and somebody in the back, is anybody in the back there responsible? Anyway, somebody be responsible to get this back to you. Here's a picture of the chestnut trees, and then here's a picture of what the land looked like after our friends, with the timber industry got through with us. So that was going on. So, you know, all that makes the current political situation in this country look pretty calm, doesn't it? So in the 1930s, you know, there was an approval to get a park. Some of the land had been bought. The timber companies were in here just raping the land as hard as they could go. And I'll talk about the timber companies because I do a lot of hiking, and a lot of you go with us. Anywhere you go in western North Carolina, you're going to run into old timber roads. You're going to run into old railroad beds. I mean, they were everywhere, literally everywhere. And you can find, you know, you find old equipment way up on top of, you know, way up on the parkway. You can find old, you know, a lot of big stuff just left up there by the timber company. And you find re-rails. Now, who knows what a re-rail is? Okay, the timber companies, when the railroads would redo a railroad because the rails had run out, they were worn out, so they just buy the old rails. That's what they'd use for the logging trains. They were re-rails, and they just leave those up. You can find them all around up there. So we got the early 30s. We're looking for money. We only got $5 million. All this is going on. And they said, you know, they're looking at the park boundaries and they're trying to raise more money. So they got a group up. Armo Camera was one of them. And they went up. They went to John D. Rockefeller and they talked to him. He gave $5 million from the Lawrence Spelman Rockefeller Foundation. And if you go to Newfound Gap, there's a plaque up there on the overlook to her. They did that. They went to Edsel Ford, who was the Ford family. He said, I'll give you $500,000. That eventually became $1.5 million. They went to James B. Duke. And he said, I'll contribute if you'll name Indian Gap for me. Well, that idea got squashed pretty quick. Because Indian Gap was, if you go up, you know, through the park, that's the first gap. That's where the Indian Trail went through the mountains from Cherokee over to Gatlinburg. Well, in the surveys, they found another gap, another gap. They found a gap about a half mile west of there, or north of there, where they're going to put the road, a Newfound Gap, and they named it Newfound Gap. Isn't that amazing? And that's why we don't have Duke gaps. Now, who owned the land in all this area? Well, 85% of it was owned by the timber company. These huge tracts, 85%. Champion Paper owned 92,800 acres. You know, beside Lake Logan and all that, they owned all that. The Ritter Lumber Company is on Hazel Creek. That's now across from Fontana Lake. Ritter had 30,000 acres. They cut 1,225,000 board feet a year. And you can go over there now and you can see where they were. They had a town over there. You got to go by boat now. Crestmont, which is down in Big Creek. You go down I-40, you see the power company, you look back up that valley, that's Big Creek. It's a huge area, but there's not a lot of flat land up there, so you couldn't really farm up there because it's all timber companies. They had 33,000 acres. They worked 2,000 people. They had a hospital. They had 2 full-time doctors. I mean, they just had a city back in there, cutting land. Now, how about the other 15%? All right, there were 1,152 small tracts of land that settlers had. Now, they had no political influence. They couldn't challenge the appraisal. I mean, they were just in there. So the timber companies went to court to challenge the appraisals, and there were long legal fights. There were legal fights up into the early 1940s. After the park had taken the land, they were still fighting. And I'll give you an example of what happened. My grandfather here in Cataloochee, a lot of you have been to his house. He had 152 acres. He had a house, a barn, a storage building. He had fields. He had orchards. He had some woodlands. The tax value was $1,250. The appraisal was $5,575. And he was offered $5,600. And my father took him to court. And he got $11,000. Now remember, this is the height of the Depression and or the depth of the Depression. And so $11,000 to a lot of people, a lot of money. But if you're living in places like Cataloochee, you know, life had passed you by and they had no future. I mean, you think you're living back there, you've got nothing. And that's where they're living. So how'd they feel about living? You're going to get a lot of answers about that when you talk to Cataloochee people. They knew the park was coming and they knew they had to leave. And throughout the park, 5,600 people had to leave. You think about that. You know, 5,600 people had to leave this area. And a lot of them compared it to the Trail of Tears when the Cherokee were thrown out in 1838. You know, but they had to leave. Some of them were not unhappy. They said, you know, we're going to start a new life. We maybe have a little money. Some of them, you know, fought it. A lot of the women were happy to leave because they were happy to get rid of that life. You know, it was tough. Stayed, and my grandfather stayed, and he was one of the very last to stay. A few people stayed and went to work for the park, such as Mark Hanna of the Hanna family, who became the ranger. Some of the other people stayed there and they ran the motor graders and they did the fire towers and did the maintenance work, but most of them had to leave. So you think about what is going on, you think about this, and you think about, you know, what happened to make this park. You know, it was a big sacrifice by a lot of people. Now, it's a Sunday afternoon in 1936. And most of the residents of the park have left. They had a picnic up at my grandfather's house. I got a picture of it. There were about 50, 60 people up there, including my father and a couple of aunts and uncles. And they're up there in attendance. And the writer, Eudora Welty, wrote, "A place that was ever lived in is like a fire that never goes out." Let me say that again. A place that was ever lived in is like a fire that never goes out. So according to legend, and I think this is true, my Aunt Effie, the oldest girl in the family, and she was a character, said, you know, we need to have a reunion. We need to come back every year. And that's how the Cataloochee reunion got born. Now, this is important. It's not a family reunion, but a reunion of families. There are a lot of, you know, you got a lot of cousins and kinfolk, but it's a reunion family. And the first one was held in August of 1937, and I was there because my mother was there 6 months later. So I was there. And I'll be truthful, I don't remember much about it. But I was there. Now, they have met every year on the second Sunday in August since only except for World War II and 1 year during COVID. And I'll pass, this was taken about 20 years ago. That's a picture. Who's in the back? Give the picture back, please. You know, that was everybody meeting. They always come back. We're gonna come back this year, and you're welcome to come. We now, in 1946, we had about 600 people there. And now we're at about 300 to 350. We take a total. They come back every year. There's no advertising or anything. They bring lunch, they bring children, they bring grandchildren. And for the first time, a couple of years ago, we didn't have anybody stand up in church who was born there. So there's still a few people left, probably half a dozen who were born in Cataloochee, but not many. So now we go with first generation. So I get to hold up my hand. That's what we do there. So let's talk about the park in general, and then I'll try to either tell some stories or I might tell about how we got the new school. Let me talk about what's different about the Great Smokies, and all this is the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. It is the most visited park in the nation, is your park. Last year, they had roughly 13.2 million visitors. We're at 13.2 million. Grand Canyon had 4.6 million. Yellowstone had 3.3 million. Yosemite had 3.7 million.
Wow.
So see, we got roughly 4 times as many people visiting the Smokies. Okay, it is the only park where a lot of people live. All these parks out west were government land anyway, and they just did a big circle and said, that's a park. And the only thing in there were maybe a few settlers and maybe a few mining companies, but there weren't people living in there. So they had the 5,600 people removed. There were very few people living in, I think, Shenandoah in Acadia, but nothing like the Smokies. They left farms and homes and churches and cemeteries. There are 160 cemeteries in the park with 4,847 graves. So, you know, all that they had to leave. The park is 522,000 acres. It borders 2 states, 7 counties, 3 congressional districts, and the Cherokee Indian Reservation. And all that makes the politics very interesting. Right. All right, 95% of the park is woodlands. I mean, it's just like you said, I mean, it's just timber. You know, there are only 2 valleys. One is Cataloochee, which is right here. The other one is Cades Cove over here, which is inside Gatlin. You've heard of Cades Cove, I'm sure. If Cades Cove were a separate park, it'd be the 6th most visited park in the nation. Last time I was through there was about 8:15 in the morning, heading up to the hike, and there were people in line to get in there. So that's all right. It has limited access. The only road through the park is Highway 441 from Cherokee up to Gatlinburg. That's the only road. A lot of parks, you know, you go to Yosemite and Yellowstone, some of these, they got good roads all over, you drive all over. You don't hear. You hike. There is only one major concessionaire, and that's Mount LeConte. Now, if you've been to Mount LeConte, raise your hand. Oh, yeah, I thought so. Yeah, we got some veterans here. Okay. It is, you know, if you go to Yellowstone and Yosemite, they got these big fancy hotels, they got restaurants, we don't have the concessionaires for the money. So that's true. You know, concessionaire is like on a park, look on a park with Pisgah Inn. That's a concessionaire. And LeConte's only open about 6 months out of the year. It is the most diverse, biodiverse regions, one of the most in the planet. And we're gonna get into some numbers here in a minute. 25 years ago, a group called Discover Life in America was formed to study life in the Smokies. They sponsor guest scientists come in and they can camp or stay up at the Purchase or somewhere and they study. And here's what they have recorded, because I talked to him day before yesterday, the guy that runs Discover Life in America. They have found 137 different species of trees. Northern Europe has 7. 70 mammals, 76 fish, 254 birds, some of them coming through, but they've located 254 birds in the park. 31 salamanders, different kinds. It's the most diverse salamander population in the world. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
40 reptiles, 40 different kinds of reptiles, snakes, turtles, and so forth. Of course, they've got microbes, fungi, algae, all that stuff that they've identified. All told, they have identified 21,799 different living species in the park. And 1,079 of them are new to science.
Wow.
And if you want something named for you, I can tell you who you make your contribution to, okay? They would be happy to hear from you. Also in the park, there are 16 mountains that go over 6,000 feet. There's 2,900 miles of streams. There are 384 miles of roads. A lot of them are pretty crude back roads, but they're that. There are 849 miles of trails, and there's 74 miles of the Appalachian Trail that starts down here in Fontana and comes out over here. So there is a lot in your park. So we got a few minutes, and I will tell one story. That somebody said if I talk, I've got to tell about how they got the new school. Some of you have probably heard that story. Well, they had the old school, and the old school, you know, this is about 1900, between 1900 and 1910, there were a lot of people in the park. You know, you got 1,200 people over there, all these kids. And the old school was a log building down, you know, by the creek, and my dad would walk down there with his sisters to go to school, my dad being the youngest. And so my grandfather and a couple of his cousins went into Waynesville, which was the county seat, to get a new school. And of course, the county commissioner said, we can't do that, you know, you don't pay enough taxes, and all Democrats, and you know, you can't do that. So, you know, being good mountain people, they were offended. So they got some bonded whiskey, and they got on their horses, they rode back up to the gap up at Cove Creek, and they got off the rest of the horses, and they had some cheese and crackers and some bonded whiskey. And this may come to a revelation to some of you here at Trinity Church, but a little drink of bonded whiskey will bring clarity to a complex problem. So they decided what they wanted to do. So they went down to the school, which was a log building. They took the desk out and they put them out in the field. They took all the books and the coats and things that the kids had left. They put them on top of the desk. They put the blackboards, or they were probably slate, on top of that. And they put a match to the school. And they shook hands and they said, nobody says anything until there's only one of us left. They burned the school. So my father and his sisters walked down to the school the next day and walked down there, and no school, you know, just burn the hulk out of it. So what happened with the school is they brought in a steam-powered sawmill. They cut the logs up, and from that they built the church. They built one of the houses. They built the new school. So that's how they got the new school. So now, fast forward up to about in the early 1930s, and my father, who lived in Atlanta, had come up, and he's talking to my grandfather, probably having a little bonded whiskey on the porch. And he said, I need to tell you a story. we told him this when my dad went berserk. And he called the paper and they wrote it up because I guess the, statute of limitations on burning a public school is. So they, they got the new school and that's how they got the school. So we got about 10 minutes. Who has a question? He was the last one. His two cousins had died, so he was the last one till he could tell the story. And it's been written up in a couple of books. And speaking of books, I put a copy of Cataloochee by Wayne Caldwell, like the author Wayne Caldwell. It's a novel, but it's a good description of life in the valley. And he talks about several things in there that actually happened. In which he took some stories and put it in that novel. And if anybody wants to borrow it, you're certainly welcome. Just get it back to me sometime. All right, who has another question?
Your family's house is still there and presumably others?
Yes.
How are they protected, taken care of? Can you visit them? Can anyone just wander up to them?
4 houses left there. My grandmother's house, the Palmer house, is still there. There's another house, one of the Hannahs lived there, which was the last house built there, and it's in pretty good shape. The Caldwell house is in there, and that's the one you see, the picture of it is white and blue. And it was built from timber from the school. And then my grandfather's is on up the valley. You have to park and walk a mile. It's a flat walk. You have to cross the creek 3 times the park is supposed to take care of them. But it's been a while and they're not the best of shape, but you can tour them and go in them. They're wide open. And the Friends of Smokies that I'm involved with, we've got a fund we're raising called Forever Places to get enough money to redo all these. We just did a couple of things in Tennessee. Got to watch us Tennessee people. I didn't say that, but we've got money to do that. And just to keep them up. Another thing that the Friends of Smokies did, we've got another fund with about $8 million and found that we formed. And it's called Trails Forever. And we hired a whole new trail crew. We've got a whole new truck with all the equipment, and they're redoing all the trails in the park. And they do fabulous work because we've got this roughly almost 900 miles of trails. So they're doing a great job with that. And interestingly enough, I was going to LeConte one time and stopped, get my breath, and this couple stopped and started talking to me, and they were from Germany. And they had hiked all over Switzerland and Pyrenees, and they couldn't believe the condition of the trails. They said, your trails are so good over here. And I said, well, thank you. I mean, you'd think in Switzerland, all they'd be perfect. So yeah, the houses are all open. Just go and walk in and see them. And the church is open, the schoolhouse is open. So I'll say this right now. If anybody wants to go to Cataloochee, get a group up and call me. And at no charge, we'll get a picnic up. We'll go over there one day. Okay?
How large does the group have to be?
Well, 2 or 3, or it doesn't matter. Who else has a question?
Can you tell us a little bit about the Friends of Smokies?
Oh, yeah. We got started 30 years ago. Basically, 3 of us did. I went to a meeting in Tennessee that a judge had over there, and he said we need to get one of these friends groups going. The large parks all have a friends groups. And we can't lobby, but we are licensed basically by the Park Service. We raise money for the parks. And we give it to the park. And we are very well, since we got going, we've raised about $95 million.
Wow.
And we've given about 60 million to the park. But we have these funds such as Trails Forever and Forever Places that we do. And so we fund a lot. This year, we're gonna give the park about $4 million. Now, the park has no entrance fee. You probably know that. Never have. And the reason we don't have an entrance fee is that when they got the park in the 1930s, in the Depression, and here goes the road over the mountain from Cherokee to Gatlinburg. So they just didn't have an entrance fee. And there are a lot of entrances into the park. So, you couldn't have an entrance everywhere. So in 1943, the state of North Carolina just deeded this road to the federal government, just said, take it. And then about 1952, the state of Tennessee, who had the rest of it going in to get from Newfound Gap down to Gatlinburg, said, we're going to give this to you on the proviso that there is you never have a toll road. So toll road meant entrance fee. Okay. And there's no way in the world that the Tennessee legislature is going to say it's okay to have entrance fee in the park with Gatlinburg and all that going on like that. So that's just politics. Anyway, so a couple of years ago, our great Superintendent Cassius Cash came up with the idea we'd have a parking fee. And now you have to have a parking pass to go to the park. So I've given a couple of talks and I listened very carefully to this. Why do I have to have a parking pass to go to the park when I don't have a parking place over there? Okay, let me say that again. Why do I have to have a parking pass to go to the park when I don't have a parking place? Okay, so it's a fundraiser. And I think we just started last year. I think they got, I don't know exactly, but they got, I think, roughly about $4 million out of that. And that's going to be a big boom for the park. Because the federal government, your federal government is not financing these parks. So who else has a question? Surely there's another one. Well, I won't, yes, you always have a question.
I'm gonna just add that, that my father went, as you know, as a young boy with his father, who was on the Tennessee Commission side. And in the 30s, mid-30s, I guess 35 or something, and they had to go by horseback. The only way to survey, to find the lines on the Tennessee side in Gatlinburg, which was nothing at that point, just to back up everything you're saying. I mean, they went by horseback. There was no road, no nothing.
No, nothing. I'll give you one more story. Spring Creek, which is right down here, it's not in the park, it's almost in the park. If you go down I-40 again and you look back, past the lake, you see that power station in there. That's Spring Creek. And it's in North Carolina by about 20 feet. I mean, the line is right there. And a friend of mine's mother went to Bernal College in Gainesville, Georgia, and she had to give 2 years of teaching. And so they put her at the Spring Creek School. Now she's in Haywood County, and Waynesville is the county seat. And she said that when she had to go to a meeting in Waynesville for the school board, that she would get on the logging train, take the logging train down to Newport, Tennessee, take the train to Asheville, and then take the train to Waynesville. And that was the quickest way to get there. I mean, that's what it's like. So I want to thank you. I'll be here to answer any more questions. Somebody get a group up. We'll go over to Cataloochee and have a picnic one day.